This talk came about from a long line of thinking and searching for the right kind of terminology to explain the way that it is that I try to approach questions of origins and communicating with people about creation. So by background, I'm a paleontologist. I study fossils, I study rocks. I enjoy learning about their patterns, their systems, and trying to understand a big picture about them, and also in the weeds and the details when I need to. I'm not a digger paleontologist by nature. I don't mind going out and digging fossils and things like that, but I'm more of a data analytics kind of guy in the way that I think about things. I like systematic stuff. If I was a theologian, I'd be a systematics guy. I wouldn't be the Hebraist. I don't like always that sort of thing. But when it comes to creation and evolution, one of the things that I always struggled with as a professor and a teacher at Liberty University was trying to get students to understand that the way that I approach creation is not by trying to simply prove evolution to be incorrect, but to try to replace it with something better. But, you know, when you tell students, I'm not an anti-evolutionist, I'm a pro-creationist, it sounds like you just want to have a lot of kids. So I just couldn't get the right words for this. I had a question that was posed to me by a friend, but he was not asking a nice question. He was asking a hard question because he was asking the questions that other people were asking him. This is Hans Matawami, and Hans is a systematic theologian. He teaches at Covenant College in Lookout, Georgia. He is a young earth creationist in theology. There are plenty of them, but not as many as I would like. And Hans was working with what was called the Henry Center at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And this Henry Center had a grant from Biologos, the theistic evolution organization, to foster dialogue on origins issues. Young earth creationists were occasionally allowed some say in that, but for the most part we weren't. But this was interesting. There was a series that was going to be done on intelligent design, on theistic evolution, on old earth creation, and on young earth creation. And each of those series would have an editor, and the editor would be in charge of setting the tone for collecting a variety of experts to answer some questions and to address the questions that they are going to ask. And Hans was the editor for young earth creation. And so he asks us this question. He said, is it really tenable to be a young earth creationist in the face of the overwhelming scientific evidence against it? Hans is my friend. I reiterate, this is not a friendly question. But Hans is asking the question the way that most other people would. And he said, listen, guys, I know you don't think it's a fair question, but it's the question. So you better answer it. Okay, so I was one of 4 individuals who was asked to respond to this and to provide some ideas. So every one of the groups, the intelligent design, the old earth, etc., they all had like 4 authors responding to questions, whatever it was that the editor asked. And so I decided to try out some new terminology. A book was published back in the 80s by religious scholar James Carsey. Now, Carsey is a religious scholar, but he's not a Christian. And he wrote this book called Finite and Infinite Games as a kind of a way of trying to establish a morality and a way of living in the world without the need for the God of the Bible. So he's basically an atheist or materialist or agnostic, and he's trying to say, how do you live a life of meaning? How do you live a life worth living? And I'm going to identify the way that we live in terms of games. So when you hear people talk about game theory, for example, Carsey was one of the people talking about life in the context of game ideas and comparing them to games. So according to Carsey, we can call any voluntary activity a game. So slavery is not a game because it's not voluntary. Okay, so there are activities that humans engage in that are non-voluntary. Those aren't games. But if you decide, this is what I'm going to do, we're going to call that a game. So games encompass all kinds of activities, and some of them are solitary, and some of them are collaborative and multiplayer, if you will. Moreover, Carsey divided all the games that we play, all the activities that we voluntarily engage in, into 2 forms. One of them are what he called finite games. So what sorts of things do you do in a finite game? And these are very general categories, right? Because it's going to be human activity and human behavior that he's calling one of two games. So the finite games have a definite beginning and a definite end to them. They start, they finish, and everybody knows when that happens. They have a fixed number of players, other people, that are involved in that game. And they have agreed upon rules. All right. So these rules can include things like scores and rankings or other metrics by way that we adjudicate who's doing well. So when we think about games, a lot of times these are the types of games that, back over here, these are the types of games that we're thinking about. We think about, baseball or something like that. Winners are declared when the game ends. Because the game, a finite game, has a definite end, you can tally up the points, you can see how fast somebody ran, you can see all sorts of stuff. In contrast, infinite games are games that had no predetermined start point and don't have a predetermined end point. In fact, they're continuous. You, as a player, actually enter into this game while it's already going on, and you stick around until you leave. This is going to involve both known and unknown players. You know some of the players that are in this game, but you might not know all of them, and you might not know if some of them are in right now or if they've left. It's a game that is constantly in flux. Calvin ball. No, it's not quite Calvin ball, but thank you for the laughs on that one. The rules of play, unlike finite games, are not fixed. They're conventions. They're just ways in which we tend to do things, but they can be challenged, they can be pressed, they can even be broken by players playing the game. Oops. So infinite games don't have agreed upon metrics, and players can engage for as long as they want. Their goal, really, of playing an infinite game is to play and persist, to stay in the game, to become better at playing the game. But sooner or later, you exit because you don't have either the resources or the desire to continue. And so you leave the game. And an infinite game is not the sort of game, it's not the sort of human activity where you can decide and declare who the winners are because the metrics are not agreed upon by all the players. So despite the fact that I've got a grilling apron that calls me the world's greatest dad, how would I actually adjudicate that? How could I actually say that I'm the world's greatest dad? By what metric? Well, maybe not by my grilling skills. It's really, those are not great. So when we think about football, finite games, we think about things like football and chess, right? You sit down, there's two players in chess, you get fixed numbers of pieces. The pieces can only move certain ways. The game ends when one person wins or it's a stalemate. That's it. It's the only way. You don't have, you have timed games and things like that, but we know the rules of chess. Football. I hate to say this to you all, go Patriots. Yes! If I'm willing to be up here without shoes on, I'm willing to say anything. So, I'm born and raised in Rhode Island. I lived closer to Foxborough, Massachusetts than most people in Boston. So I come by this honestly, at least. And I lived through bad years and current years, right? So, but I lived through 19 good ones, right? So, football. We love, this is such an American sport. We love it. We invest so much time. And we know at 1 o'clock is kickoff. And by about 4 o'clock, it's done. And whoever has more points at the end of the game wins. That's it. But there are non-sports games out there too. Remember, Carsey says any voluntary human activity. Now, infinite games, what would be the comparison to these? Well, fitness. Do you want to be a fit individual? That's a game. But is it a finite game? No. You're going to be at it as long as you want. And you're going to do it the way that you think ought to be done. You don't have fixed rules telling you how it has to be done. Now, you might have a coach that tells you, do it this way, but you can get rid of your coach and still be fit. Strategic thinking, right? That is a discipline. How do you do that? How do you determine that you're the best strategic thinker versus other people? Is that a winnable game? No, it's not, but you can get good at it. And you can be poor at it, right? An election is a non-sport finite game. You have to be a candidate by a certain time in order to get your name on the ballot. In order to get your name on the ballot, you've got to get signatures. And then once your name is on the ballot, you have a certain point of time in which you can try to get people to vote for you ultimately on one particular day. And there's rules about how you can raise money, what you can spend that money on. There's all sorts of rules about being a candidate. And at the end of the election, you count the votes, winner, loser, runoff, whatever you need to do. There are rules. But who's a great leader? What does the game of leadership look like? Very different for very different people. Are there any rules for leadership? Conventions. Things that work in your current situation. Are there ways that you could completely upend the way that everybody else plays leadership because you did it some way different? Absolutely. Because there's no fixed rule here. Theology 101. It's a college class. It starts in August. It ends in early December. You've got papers, you've got discussion boards, you've got tests, you've got whatever else it is that are the assignments. And at the end of the day, you get an A, a B, a C, or some of the other letters we'd prefer not to mention. You can also drop out, right? You haven't failed the game, but you've quit that game. But by the end of December, there will be a grade. There's no getting away from that. But becoming Christ-like is not a finite game. It is an infinite game. To become more like Christ, there are conventions that the Bible provides us with, but mostly conventions because human behavior is complex. Jesus calls us to be more holy. He calls us to be more gentle. He calls us to be meek. He calls us to be bold. He calls us to be faithful. And there's lots of different ways that we can do this. Lots of different ways that I am becoming Christ-like, and yet there's lots of ways that I'm not. I haven't focused my prayer life in the right way. I'll just be honest with you. That's one of the places I struggle. Prayer is not something I do easily. But thankfully, grace is something that the Lord has built with me. Okay. And when you're in a finite game, this is where things get interesting. I did not find this by reading Carsey. I eventually did read Carsey, but I found out about Carsey's finite and infinite games from this guy, Simon Sinek. Anybody heard of Simon Sinek before? Okay, business folks. Simon Sinek is an organizational consultant, which sounds like a guy who doesn't have a real job. No, the guy's got a real job. He is so perceptive. He comes into companies, he looks at the structure of what's going on, and he helps to get those companies to operate more effectively with their people and to treat their people better, to figure out where there's friction and whatnot. He's incredibly insightful in human psychology, and he talks to people all the time. And he wrote a book here called The Infinite Game. He took Carsey's ideas and applied them to the business world in a way that helped me with creation. So we're still on track here. We encounter both kinds of games in life. We all engage in both finite and infinite games. But the games are played by different sorts of rules, right? Finite games require strategies that win by defeating opponents or performing to a certain level on a metric. You want to get an A in a class doesn't mean that you have to defeat the other students. You have to just do well. But if you want to win a football game, there's no way of all of us winning together. That little league is not where my kids go. You have real winners. You have real losers. In an election, at the end, you don't get multiple people who end up being your senator. One. That's it. Infinite games require strategies, however, that require you to try to play better than the other players. It's a little more comparative and not quite as aggressive. I mean, it can be aggressive, but the point of a finite game is to win. The point of a finite game is to play, and to play better. And Sinek introduces the concept here of the big difference between these two is that in finite games, you have opponents, but in infinite games, you have rivals. Sherlock Holmes needs Moriarty. He really does. To become the true Sherlock Holmes that he can be, he needs to be pushed by someone so deviously brilliant that his mind is pushed beyond where he would have otherwise been. He needs a rival. Now, he still needs to get Moriarty in jail. But Sinek has observed that businesses often fall prey to playing infinite games by finite game methods. When he looks around and he looks at businesses that are doing poorly, sometimes the reason for that is that they are so focused on the other opponents in their field that should be viewed as their rivals, not their opponents. They're spending their money, they're spending their advertising, trying to do all sorts of stuff. They are too opponent-focused. They have a win-loss mentality, and they use arbitrary rankings like my grill apron to say that they're number one. How many truck commercials can you think of that have claimed that they are the best truck in enter whatever metric they use? Towing capacity, payload, acceleration, safety. That's minivans. Everybody's minivan has got to be number one in safety. Why do they choose that one? Why does Ford choose this one and GM choose another? It's because they've built vehicles that are very similar but different enough to say, hey, you know, if you want to pull a house off of a foundation, GMC's got that one. You get the diesel, it will pretty much take your home off. But can it go as fast as a Ford? As quickly? Maybe not. What's Dodge doing? Don't know. But you can see how that happened. He gives some great examples of even companies that start doing that to each other, and they destroy each other, and both fail because they kept trying to one-up one another, tried to poach each other's talent, tried to show and steal and do all these things. And meanwhile, somebody else comes along with a finite game thinking, going, those guys are crazy. I've got to play a better game myself. And the next thing that you know, you've got another company that puts them all behind because they were thinking about what they're doing. The game of business is not a finite game. And I say that now because now I'm a business guy, I run a company, and I have to look at some of the other companies out there that make school supplies and science materials, and I can't look at them as opponents because I can't defeat them. I can't do that. But what I can do is I can play my game better, and maybe I can even play some of the game that they do better than they do. But then there's other companies that I just look at them, they're going to be better. That's okay. How do I play my game? So finite game strategies in an infinite game are ineffective and destructive. In finite games, they're perfectly fine because you have an opponent that you need to beat. If you take a fitness approach to playing a football game, you're going to lose. Like, oh, but I did great warm-ups. And I continued to do great warm-ups while the other team snapped the ball and ran to the end zone. Dummy, you can't do that. Being a good, fit person doesn't mean that you're going to play a good football game. You got to play by the right strategies. And we can't afford, as he points out with businesses, to have resources that are spent to defeat opponents when you're not playing that type of game. It's not being better. And you have to keep in mind also that in an infinite game, you can be blindsided by new players, players that you didn't know that were in the game. I would submit that a lot of young Earth creation research and writing has been dedicated to showing that evolution is wrong. There's a place for that. And the same can be said for a lot of the old Earth creation and intelligent design publications. I'm going to throw up a couple of book titles here from a variety of different perspectives, and I'm not picking on them because of a finite game approach. There can be a place for that in creation evolution types of issues. But let's look at a couple of these titles. The Handy Dandy Evolution Refuter, that's a fun one. That's a really old book. Henry Morris wrote a book that was basically a publication of all of the quotes that he had for when he was doing debates called That Their Words May Be Used Against Them. Philip Johnson, the founder of the intelligent design community, published a book called Darwin on Trial, which was largely a critique of evolution. Jerry Bergman, more recently, Evolution's blunders, I can't read it all here, but anyway, evolution makes loads of mistakes. These are examples of finite game types of approaches, as if creation and evolution, or intelligent design and evolution, are the only two options on the table, and if I can defeat my opponent, I win. But that's not the game that we're in. Now, the benefits of finite game approaches is that they can address particular issues and topics of the day. A debate or non-debate, whatever we're going to be seeing here this evening with Dr. White, the dialogue, right? But if it's a debate, and he was mentioning the other night how he prefers them because you can have a specific claim, and you have measured time, and you have specific arguments, and at the end of the day, you can adjudicate who made the better argument out of that, right? We even have debate clubs that have specific scoring and points. That's a finite game. So within my experience as a young Earth creationist, the classes that I was teaching were finite games. If I had a debate with somebody, that's a finite game. But that's only a component of my approach as an infinite game player, which I'll be getting to. But the benefits that we have here is that this can address specific issues and topics of the day, usually with great detail. And it can provide creationists or others with specific answers to particular claims and provide refutations. So you can get answers out of this. It's not like playing a finite game is a wrong thing. It's just you got to know what game you are playing. There are drawbacks here. A finite game approach to creation evolution means that, well, the issues and the topics change, and so there's a question of relevance, right? If we're talking about spontaneous generation of life, or if we're talking about plate tectonics, or if we're talking in geology before plate tectonics, arguments about geology before plate tectonics don't make any sense today. The paradigm shift between how we thought about the world with static, non-moving continents had an entire vocabulary and set of scientific premises and hypotheses and whatnot that after plate tectonics, we don't even use the words anymore. It's nonsense. It doesn't make any... So if you were an anti-evolutionist at that time, back in, say, the 1940s, then you'd be out of step with the discussion today. It's fine. Things change. It's science. We got counter-arguments that are developed. So you could win a finite game, but you could lose the next finite game if somebody comes up with a response that works against your argument. And I find that a lot of times it's very reactive. It's not proactive. Most evolutionists, to be honest, don't care one bit whatsoever what creationists or intelligent design activists are doing. They don't know. They don't care. It's not affecting them because they are doing their science. And what kind of game is science? Infinite or finite? What do you guys think? Science. It's an infinite game, right? It was going on before any of us were born. It's going to continue on forever. It's got all sorts of rules and conventions that change because science in the 1800s is different from science in the 1900s, which is different from science today. And is it all underpinned by philosophical reasons? Yes, it certainly is. But still, our methods and our tools and our ways of even adjudicating what is good science versus not good science are human conventions. So science is an infinite game. And if my evolutionary colleagues are playing an infinite game and I as a creationist am playing a finite game, I'm going to be playing nothing but finite games as they keep going on. Showing that your opponent is wrong also doesn't prove that you're correct when there's more than two options on the table. Let's say that theistic evolution is the third option, right? You've got, say, young Earth creation, you've got old Earth creation, theistic evolution, materialist evolution, you have Buddhist views of evolution, Hindu views, but let's just take four, right? If I'm a young Earth creationist and I show a convincing argument that materialistic evolution is incorrect, have I shown that I am right? No. There are three other options on the table, and because this is an infinite game, there could be others I'm unaware of. Now, showing that your opponent is wrong can be helpful. It can be guiding and steering, but it also doesn't fully answer the question. So let me return to Hans's question, right? His question was, is it tenable to be a young Earth creationist when all the overwhelming scientific evidence is against you? Let me rephrase that. Hans is asking, how can you keep playing a game when you've already lost? I think that's a pretty good way of saying it. He's saying, how do you keep doing this? You've lost the game. Well, I would say young Earth creation cannot be merely anti-evolution. It has to be anchored in infinite game theory and strategy. Again, finite games will come and go because that's their nature. There will be debates, there will be books, there will be all these different things that will be part of it. But what is our real goal as creationists then? If we're going to have the mentality that creationism is something that has been going on in the past, continues, and must continue in the present, into the future, our goal, I would say, is to discover the works of God through his created world while being guided by his inspired word. When have you seen young Earth creationism defined this way? Right? It's usually a propositional set, and I get that, right? We believe certain things about young Earth creationism. But in order to be a creationist, it means that you believe those propositions, but how are you going to move forward? This is, in one sense, kind of a timeless statement. Discover the works of God through his created world, guided by his inspired word. I hope this is a sort of thing that can be the same into the future. Infinite game thinking is going to focus on two things. It's going to focus on the game itself and the player. This is how you do infinite games. You've got to focus on how do I play the game. So what is the game then, and what is the player? Well, the game, I think, is that science exists first and foremost to exalt God. It's his world. We have been given stewardship, we have given dominion, therefore we must discover what's in it so that we can do our job as image bearers well. And if we do that well, God is glorified and pleased. The player then is us, which means that we must focus on excellence in the execution of our own work. It doesn't mean that we'll do it perfectly, but by whatever conventions and standards we happen to have available right now, we try to excel. So infinite game thinking about creation is going to have an emphasis on organizing our knowledge, directing our intellectual pursuits. It's going to be about identifying problems and giving us guidance about how to address them. And it's going to be proactive, not reactive, and investigative, and it's going to be curious. I got into science because when I was 4 years old, right, and a little baby kid, little proto Dr. Ross. He was not barefoot at that time. His mom liked shoes. I went to my cousin's house, and he had a record. Some of you know what those are. It was one of those little learn-to-read records, the 45s, with the book that went beside it. It was about dinosaurs. He didn't have the book, so we were just listening to the record. And there was the narrator, of course, but then there was the music and the roaring and the crashing, dun, dun, dun. And it blew my 4-year-old mind. Every circuit fried. I was like, Mom, dinosaurs, right? And so she went over to the store and bought me the plastic Bag-O dinosaurs. We all know, the older ones of us, we know the multicolored pack of dinosaurs with the Trachodon. Karate pose. The T-Rex that never stood up because he was like on his toes and always fell. We had the ugliest toys. We didn't have good stuff back then. People talk about the good old days. Good old days didn't have good dinosaurs, I'll tell you that much. We didn't have good dinosaurs until 1993, and that's when Jurassic Park came out. Praise the Lord. I've been to every one of those shows, almost every one of those shows on opening night. It's even the last one, which was, it hurt. It hurt. Anyway, but curiosity. I was blown away by the idea of dinosaurs, and I went to the library because my mom took us to the library, walked to the library, and we got dinosaur books. And I became a Christian around the same time. I was 4 when I learned about dinosaurs. I was probably about 5 or 6 when I accepted Christ. And it would be the age of 9 that I first remember sitting in my playroom and thinking for a moment that the dinosaur books and what I thought the Bible was teaching weren't telling me the same thing. And so as a little 9-year-old kid in our playroom next to my bin of Legos, I'm thinking through ideas that I didn't know had names, but would be things like gap theory and day-age ideas. Are these ways that I can understand the Bible and the dinosaur books together? Because the dinosaur books are talking about millions of years ago, and the Bible doesn't seem to be giving that. Well, maybe it does, and I haven't understood it right. To the parents out there, your kids are thinking deep thoughts. I was a weird little kid thinking that stuff, but now I have kids who realize, no. Kids are sharp. They're smart, and I'm glad to see so many of them here. Yep, I see that hand going, we want meat. We want to think. Praise God. So I didn't have the answers then, but I thought, like, the Bible seems to be pretty clear, and I know that's written by God. So, if the dinosaur books aren't written by God, so they might have some mistakes. So I'm going to go with God on this, but I'm not throwing away that there are dinosaurs or anything like that. There really are. You can go to our museums, and eventually I'd excavate stuff and things like that. We don't make them up. We dig them out. That's a big difference. Curiosity. It is the source for human advancement given to us by God. So here's some examples of creationist writing that do that well. Henry Morris and John Whitcomb's The Genesis Flood put a stake in the ground and planted a flag saying not only is evolution wrong, but this is the way forward. This is the way to understand the scripture, and this is the way to understand the science. Now, did they get everything right? Of course not. They were writing in the 1960s, and there were different scientific models. What we are writing today is not going to be 100% right either, because we have certain biases, objectives, ways that we think about the world that are just going to turn out to be wrong. The history of science is the history of a lot of wrong ideas and a few right ones. It's okay. That's okay. Wheat and chaff. The Genesis flood galvanized the young earth creation movement, which was disorganized and nascent. And it did so because Whitcomb and Morris gave us an infinite game thinking. After that, a lot of what Morris wrote was mostly finite game thinking, but not all of it. He did infinite game thinking, but he did a lot of finite game, like that book, that their words may be used against them. Use this in a debate. I will say I know evolutionists who were furious with that book, not because it was used as a weapon and because they felt that they weren't being treated fairly. And that hit me pretty hard because in some cases they were right. Faith, Form, and Time, written by my good friend Kurt Wise, who like me is also a paleontologist. I've got this book, The Quest, out on our table, written by my friend Dr. Todd Wood. He's a biochemist. And that book is all about what do you do when you hit hard questions and you don't know answers. And you might not even know not just the answer, but how to even approach getting an answer. How do you remain faithful? Where do you draw strength? How do you gain inspiration? Where has that happened and we have gotten answers? And where is it happening right now where we don't? And how do you remain comfortable with the Lord in the face of difficulty? It's a very personal and very emotionally connected book. And of all the things that I've ever used in college classes, I've gotten more responses from my students about how much they loved that book because of its honesty. We don't have all the answers. And when you say, I don't have an answer to a room full of folks, especially those who might be critical or skeptical of you, it does earn you some points that when you have an answer for something, they think, well, maybe they do, because they're willing to be vulnerable and say that they don't in other places. Leonard Brand and Art Chadwick's textbook, Faith, Reason, and Earth History, is basically the creationist equivalent to an evolutionary biology textbook that would be used in class. It goes through all sorts of evidences from biology and geology, et cetera, as to why a young Earth creation perspective can make sense. In fact, they balance back and forth between evolutionary ideas and creationist ideas, and they present evolutionary ideas as if they're evolutionists, and then they present creationist ideas after that. The hallmark of critical thinking is not being able to fill out the right bubble on a multiple choice question. The hallmark of critical thinking, the pinnacle that you can get to is, can you articulate a different idea that you don't hold with such great accuracy that someone would mistake you for an adherent? Can you do that? If you can, then you understand the other side. So let me give you two examples from geology, quickly. As examples of infinite game thinking. My talk later this afternoon is going to be more of an extended version of infinite game thinking as we think about Adam. But for the moment, I want to talk about geology and I want to talk about my friends. Here's my friend, Dr. John Whitmore. Well, it's actually not my friend John Whitmore, that's just a picture of him. But John Whitmore teaches at Cedarville University in Ohio. He's a geologist. He actually learned geology under Leonard Brand, who was one of the authors I just mentioned. And for the past 2 decades, he has been bringing scores of students out to what's called the Coconino Sandstone, which is a layer of sandstone rock in Arizona. You can see it in the Grand Canyon, but you can trace it all the way over to Las Vegas, Nevada. It's a very extensive sandstone, and it's illustrated out here. You can see these weird angle lines. The rock is not tilted there. The rock is actually straight. The angle lines are formed as sand moves and creates dune systems that are angled within a package that's overall flat. So as a sand dune forms, it forms by moving sand up one face of the sand dune, and then the sand falls down the other side, which is steeper. And then as the next sand dune comes over, it shears off some of that, but it leaves some of that angled sand behind underneath it and buries it. And so the lines that you can see going from the top left to the bottom right are actually telling me that the sand wave that formed them was moving from left to right. The steep lines are the lines that you're seeing from the dune. But down at the bottom, you can see it's sort of flat. That was where the dune had been sheared off. So the layers are flat, but they have these internal layers that we call cross beds because they go across the main bed of the sandstone. Around here, you see all these limestones. Everything's super flat. It's pretty cool. And I want to collect a lot of rocks while I'm here. And nice thing about Nashville, it's a growing town. You got construction everywhere, and you're like, we know. But I'm like, no, you got fossils in there. This is great. I'm gonna get them. I'll sell them all. No, whatever. Now, what Dr. Whitmore has been working on is he's discovered that there are numerous features in this Coconino sandstone that are consistent with being deposited under deep water rather than a wind-based dune like you'd see in the Sahara Desert. This is important because the Coconino sandstone has been used as an example by evolutionists and old Earth geologists that young Earth creation flood geology is impossible. Why? Because the Coconino sandstone looks like a buried sand dune from the Sahara. It is a wind-blown drift, and you can't have that smack dab in the middle of Noah's flood. Because this is down low in the geological record. This would be in everything that creationists think is flood-derived rocks, and they're saying can't be flood because it's as dry as can be. That is a challenge. That's a big challenge. So Dr. John Whitmore said, well, let's go look at it. He's a hands-on guy. I'm the systematics guy. Dr. Whitmore he's a great systematic thinker, but he is a field guy. And every single year, 20 years, bringing students out there, collecting samples, measuring the rock, measuring all the angles on these crossbeds. Oh yeah, that actually is important to scientists. We measure the angles on crossbeds because the angles at which they form give us some idea as to what kind of processes are forming them. We use looking around at the world today, what can make these things, and that narrows down our options. This is why the evolutionists or the old age geologists say these can only be formed in sand dunes because those angles are only made in sand dunes. Well, it turns out they haven't done their measurements very well. They've relied on other people who reported measurements very early. Or they take a picture like this and they measure it with a protractor and they say, okay, no, you got to get up on the rock. Because sometimes rocks are also angled internally in different ways. And with all kinds of measurements, observations, taking small sections of the rock, grinding them down till they're transparent, looking at them under a microscope. This is what we call doing thin section work. Here are some things that he has discovered. And here's a picture of one of those thin sections. When we look at the petrology, that is the nature of the rock, when we look at the fossil footprints that are found on these little crossbeds and slip faces, you look at the sedimentology. What are the components that make up the sand grains? We look at the stratigraphy. How is it connected in terms of layers, one to the other? And we also, or he also and his folks look at things like soft sediment deformation. That is, before the rock is hard, when it's all still soft sand, sometimes things happen to it. You get slips, you get folds, you get things like that, that all indicate that things are happening to this rock before it's been solidified. It's still loose. So he'll measure all of those crossbeds and put together a giant histogram like this. And it turns out that histogram, and when you take a look at them compared to wind-blown dunes, the histograms have peaks at different areas. And the peaks that he's constantly seeing, the majority area of the crossbeds fall under the types of dunes that are formed not in the air but deep underwater by very fast currents, strong, powerful ocean water. And they kind of go, really? Because I thought this was a dune. He's like, nope. Evidence number one, this isn't a dune. Evidence number two, there are footprints of animals, little amphibians or reptiles. It's hard to tell. There's also insect things and whatnot. But the image that I have up over here is of some amphibian or reptile tracks. And the arrows indicate the direction that the animal ends up going, right? Kind of up and to the right. But the animal's footprints themselves are actually oriented straight up. It is being pushed to the right, even though it's trying to walk straight. That does not happen in wind. If the wind is that strong, the animal hunkers down and waits because it's actually dangerous to walk around. But if the animal is in a current underwater, it will keep going, and it doesn't take much current to push a little lizard a bit to the right. So the footprints here give us indicators that the animals are underwater. Also, the excellent preservation of the footprints, numerous experiments done by Leonard Brand, his PhD advisor, showed that these types of footprints are made in sediment that is completely saturated with water, not dry sand. If you've walked around on dry sand on a beach, you don't leave good detailed footprints. You leave a big old pad. Soft sediment deformation. Things like this is a fold in the rock that happened before the rock was solidified. Really weird sorts of stuff. Now, I've mentioned Leonard Brand a couple of times now as Dr. Whitmore's PhD advisor. Dr. Brand is still alive. In fact, that's him on the lower part, and his colleague, Dr. Art Chadwick, both good friends of mine. And as I said, they wrote this book, Faith, Reason, and Earth History, which, by the way, is free to download. If you go to the Amazon page for it, you can purchase a hard copy, but you can get the digital for no cost at all. They are Seventh-day Adventists, and the Adventist Church subsidized the publication of this to make sure that there were free options. Wonderful. So they have been involved in a long-standing series of stuff. These guys, likewise, they're diggers, they're doers, they're field guys. Both of them were biologists who have also decided to become paleontologists, and they go to geology conventions and speak to secular groups about their research all the time. Dr. Art Chadwick runs a dinosaur dig site. Any of you see the documentary Is Genesis History? Okay. That was Dr. Art Chadwick's dino dig site. It's been operating now for 20 years. They've excavated thousands and thousands of dinosaur bones. They've got data sets. They've got publications. This is rigorous science, and they don't publish it just in the creation literature. They go straight to the secular literature and say, to the extent that they can talk about their ideas, this is what we've got. Impressive stuff. They've studied whale fossils that were buried catastrophically in Peru, and their research on that got published in the journal Geology in 2004. It actually took the cover picture from that and put it on the cover. These guys are known young Earth creationists, and yet the biggest geology journal in the world took their research, published their research, and put it on the front cover. And my own PhD advisor was editor at the time, and he knew who these guys were, and he said, that was an awesome paper. I'm proud of them. So if you think that all evolutionists are hostile, they are hostile to certain ideas, but that doesn't mean that they're hostile to people. And sometimes it does mean that you have to play by certain rules. They can't talk about all the things that they think about creation in that paper going to geology. But they can show that the whales that they uncovered and excavated were catastrophically buried in an incredibly rapid pace because even the baleen of the whales was preserved. And they originally said it would have taken weeks to months to bury it. They thought it was faster, but they didn't think that could get through the reviewers if they said anything faster. The reviewers came back and said, that's not good enough. It's got to be hours or days. The reviewers. So they got to put hours to days in their paper, right? Or days to weeks, I think is what got in. They got in because their work was excellent and because it's long-term, patient science. They've discovered something new that God had laid hidden, and now he has allowed us to learn. That is the joy of discovery. They've studied organismal behavior. They've looked at the coquinino trackways, as I mentioned. That was Dr. Leonard Brand's work. Bioturbation in sedimentary rocks. The last thing that I'll mention here as an example, they've just published a paper on this in a brand new creation outlet called newcreation.blog. And New Creation blog has been going on for a little while, but just 2 weeks ago, they launched what's called New Creation, not research, but New Creation, it's a journal on that. And Dr. Chadwick and Brand here have an inaugural paper in that where they highlight some of this research. Now, what is bioturbation? It's a big sciencey word, but let's break it down. Bio means life, right? Study biology. Turbid means stirred up, cloudy. So bioturbation is when critters stir things up. It's when they dig through soil or sediment looking for food or making burrows. And so you've got worms and shrimp and clams and things like that in the modern world that when there are nice layers in the ocean, they start digging around through them because they're looking for things to eat. They're looking to hide. They're looking to do whatever. And these things burrow fast, very, very fast. If we were to dredge a section in the Chesapeake Bay, for example, and this was done by I think it was Kate Berensmeyer's group. They took a quadrant 1 meter by 1 meter, they filled it with nice layered sediment, and they put in just 10 organisms, 1 meter by 1 meter, 10 organisms, like 2 shrimp, a couple of clams, and a few worms. And they said, okay, go for it. Well, turns out that within several days, it was completely bioturbated. But that's not many animals compared to what you might find in, say, offshore Atlantic or the Chesapeake Bay. When they put in more like 100 animals, which would have been far more compatible with the Chesapeake Bay, 61 minutes. And there were no discernible layers left. So animals stir up the sediment, and they do it very quickly. Here's how we would measure if we were looking at the side of these rocks that are over here in and around town. We would recognize A, B, C, D, E, different layers of how much stir up there has been, going from basically none to the whole thing's homogenized and it's just a big lump of rock. So we would expect, if the Earth is very ancient, that there would be lots and lots of this because it takes time for sediments to be laid down. Sometimes they can be laid down catastrophically in an old Earth view, but still then there's going to be a pause after that and critters are going to start stirring things up. Well, Leonard Brand and Art Chadwick, I'm going to jump forward here, did a full survey of 1 vertical mile of rock. They started in the Grand Canyon and basically walked their way to Wyoming, studying all the rocks going from the Cambrian up through the Eocene. And you got a little geologic timescale that goes from basically the bottom of the blue to into the yellow. It's most of the geologic record, and the fossil record as we think of it. All of the units did show some bioturbation, but what was interesting is that 90% of them showed level 1, basically nothing. You can't ever say that it's nothing because there could be some, but basically there's nothing there. 90% of the rock record showed basically no bioturbation. If the Earth is ancient, why would that be the case? But if the world's geology was formed quickly, under conditions of a catastrophic flood, there isn't time. The animals don't have time to do this. They're too busy dying. This is the most extensive. They also noted that the most extensive bioturbation tended to be near the top of units, which is exactly where there would be some sort of pause or shift in the geological action. The top of a unit means that it's the end of the deposition of that unit. Something else is happening. So they have fancy diagrams that look like this, and many, many more of them now in the paper that they just published. Looking at, okay, on the far end, we've got the whole geologic column that they were looking at, and all the little squiggles indicate places where they saw some bioturbation of any kind. So, an old Earth geologist might say, see, there's bioturbation everywhere. It's like, yeah, but let's look granular. Let's look closer at the actual rocks. Let's take a typical one. So B is a column of a typical rock of their studies, and you can see this big solid black line here. That is level 1 bioturbation, basically nothing the whole way through. This was average. One of the most extensive bioturbated zones, they publish right next to it, that unit C, And you can see that most of Unit C is actually all on the level 1. And there are a few places where you get into zones 3 and 4, but very small units, pauses in the action. This was one of the most heavily bioturbated units they studied. And that's what I like about Leonard Brand and Art Chadwick. They're going to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly. They're going to show you all the data because that is what honors the Lord. It's His world. This is what we found. We'll tell people about it. We don't hide it because it might be inconvenient. But this is infinite game thinking. There's lots of other good work going on. We are going to be looking at some of this here, but all these different topics are things where infinite game creation research is happening. So our talk this afternoon is going to look at hominins and Adam and paleoanthropology. Again, the aim of what we do is to discover the works of God through His created world and guided by His inspired word. If we do that, then we will not be merely reacting to every new discovery that you find on the news about what an evolutionist has made and thinking to ourselves, another transitional form that we have to argue against. This is something new that God has let us know. Rejoice. You don't have to rejoice in the interpretation, but there's something new. Somebody finds a fossil and they say it's a perfect intermediate between an amphibian and a reptile. I'm like, I want to see it. Not because I want to see it. No, change your thinking. God's world is part of what He's given us. It's the reason we're here is to steward this place. We are to be His image. That Hebrew word is tselem. And it's the same word that's talked about when God says, you will not make for yourself any graven tselem. Why does God tell us not to make any graven image? Well, one is you can't represent God accurately with a graven image. But second, He already did it. He made us His tselem. That is a physical representation that on earth says God rules here. This is God, and that's why the Holy Spirit can be in us and not in other things. We'll talk about Adam and humans and whatnot later. But when we think about that, this is the way to go. Now, these examples do not show that evolution is disproven or that old Earth views are entirely wrong or that the Bible is even proven correct. That's not what this does. These scientific discoveries are consistent with young Earth predictions and expectations. But like all science, they are limited and they are fallible. They give us some good reason, signposts, as my friend Todd Wood says in the book, The Quest. They give us signposts to know that we're on the right track. What I can say here is that young Earth creationism provides viable guidance for scientific investigation. Unlike what Bill Nye said in the clip that we looked at, it's just how you can't do anything. These guys do stuff. And they do stuff that's good enough, that's recognized by non-creationists, that they go, hey, that was good. That's a testimony. That's salt. That's light. That's being in the world, but not of the world. So we've got guidance. Good scientific work results in discoveries. And young Earth creations can then disseminate that information and glean from these interpretations, both within and beyond a young Earth view and beyond young Earth venues. If we're going to be in the world but not of it, it means that I, as a young Earth creationist, for as much as I'm going to spend my time talking with other young Earth creationists about my ideas, I got to get them out sooner or later. Because if I just hermetically seal us and hunker down and say that it's just wait till Jesus comes back, then that aspect of being Christ-like is being neglected. So there are other members that answered Hans Mattawamy's challenge. And you can take a look at those at the Henry Center website. Dr. Joe Francis is a biologist. Dr. Stephen Lloyd is a theologian. Dr. Gordon Wilson is also a biologist. And Hans Mattawamy also has some reflections. The second round after this was rough. He pulled some old Earth geologists in and said, contradict what Marcus said. And they did and said, Marcus, answer back, right? This is what we got to do. You want to step up to the plate, it means that somebody's throwing pitches. Can you hit them? So I thank Hans very deeply for that, and I thank John Whitmore, I thank Leonard Brand, Art Chadwick, Todd Wood, Kurt Wise, Henry Morris, and John Whitcomb for showing us how infinite game thinking can produce the type of results for creation that are going to move us into the future, and not just keep reacting against other people who are playing the game and we're playing it the wrong way. Let's play the right game the right way. Lord bless you.